The whites first, sir. Flight attendant Rachel Morrison said coldly to the black man standing in the aisle, her voice carrying across the first-class cabin with shocking clarity. That's how we handle boarding priority on this airline. You'll need to wait until our preferred passengers are seated. Her hand gestured dismissively toward the economy section as she turned her attention to the white family behind him, her smile brightening instantly. Right this way, folks. Let me help you get settled into your first-class seats. What Rachel didn't know was that the man she had just humiliated in front of an entire cabin of passengers wasn't just another traveler hoping for an upgrade. In just a few moments, she would discover that her racist comment had been directed at someone who could end not just her career, but transform the entire airline industry. Because sometimes, the person you underestimate with your prejudice holds the power to change everything. Have you ever witnessed discrimination so blatant that it took your breath away? This story shows what happens when centuries-old racism meets modern consequences in the most satisfying way imaginable. If you believe that everyone deserves respect regardless of their skin color, hit that subscribe button right now and comment equality below to stand with us against discrimination. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the terminal at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport as passengers hurried toward Gate B14 for Delta Flight 2847 to Los Angeles. The flight was fully booked, a mix of business travelers heading to important meetings, families starting their vacations, and leisure travelers seeking California sunshine. Among them walked Dr. James Mitchell, a distinguished black man in his early 50s, dressed in a comfortable navy blazer and dark slacks, carrying a simple leather laptop bag that had accompanied him on countless business trips over the past 2 decades. To anyone watching, Dr. Mitchell appeared to be exactly what he was, a successful professional, perhaps a lawyer or consultant, heading to the West Coast for business. His appearance was understated but elegant, his demeanor calm and confident, his movements purposeful but unhurried. What none of the other passengers or airport staff could have guessed was that Dr. James Mitchell was actually the founder, chairman, and CEO of Mitchell Global Airways, a massive aviation conglomerate that had quietly acquired controlling interests in 7 major airlines over the past 15 years, including a 43% stake in Delta Airlines itself. Dr. Mitchell's journey to the pinnacle of the aviation industry had been anything but conventional. Born in rural Alabama in 1972 to parents who worked as sharecroppers, James had grown up in poverty so profound that his family often went days without adequate food. His childhood was marked by the daily reality of systemic racism in the Deep South, where black children were expected to accept limitations on their dreams and ambitions. But James Mitchell had refused to accept those limitations, even when teachers, counselors, and community leaders told him that someone with his background should set more realistic goals. Despite graduating valedictorian from his high school class, James was rejected by 17 different colleges before finally receiving a partial scholarship to a small historically black university in Georgia. He worked 3 jobs while earning his undergraduate degree in business administration, sending money home to help his family while maintaining a perfect 4.0 grade point average. His exceptional academic performance earned him a full scholarship to Harvard Business School, where he became the first person in his family's history to earn a graduate degree. But even Harvard's prestigious MBA program couldn't shield James from the persistent discrimination that followed him throughout his early career. Despite his exceptional qualifications and academic achievements, he was rejected by every major corporation he applied to work for after graduation. The rejection letters were polite, but the message was clear. Someone who looked like James Mitchell, regardless of his credentials or capabilities, didn't belong in corporate America's executive suites. Instead of accepting these limitations, James used his savings and a small business loan to start Mitchell Consulting Services, providing strategic planning and operational efficiency advice to small and medium-sized businesses. His analytical brilliance and innovative approaches to complex business problems quickly earned him a reputation among clients who cared more about results than appearances. Within 5 years, his consulting firm was generating millions in annual revenue and attracting attention from major corporations that had previously rejected his job applications. But James's true passion had always been aviation. As a child, he had watched planes fly overhead and dreamed of not just flying in them, but owning them. Throughout his consulting career, he had specialized in aviation industry clients, learning every aspect of airline operations from fuel procurement to route optimization to customer service management. By the time he was 35, James knew more about airline profitability and efficiency than most industry executives who had spent their entire careers in aviation. That expertise allowed him to identify undervalued airline assets and acquisition opportunities that other investors had overlooked. Starting with a small regional carrier that was facing bankruptcy, James applied his operational knowledge and business acumen to turn the failing airline into a profitable enterprise within 18 months. The success of that first acquisition attracted investor attention and provided the capital for larger deals. Over the next decade, James had quietly assembled one of the most powerful aviation empires in the world. His companies owned stakes in airlines across 6 continents, operated more than 400 aircraft, employed over 30,000 people, and generated annual revenues exceeding $12 billion. Yet James had deliberately kept his ownership structure complex and private, using shell companies and investment funds to hide the extent of his control over major airline properties. The reason for this secrecy wasn't modesty or privacy concerns. It was strategic intelligence gathering. James had built his empire by understanding airline operations better than his competitors, and part of that understanding came from experiencing air travel as an ordinary passenger rather than as a recognized executive. When airline employees knew they were serving the company owner, their behavior changed dramatically. But when they believed they were serving just another black passenger, their true attitudes and biases became clearly visible. For the past 2 years, James had been conducting systematic undercover assessments of customer service quality across his airline properties. What he had discovered was deeply disturbing, persistent patterns of discriminatory treatment that varied dramatically based on passenger race, age, and apparent socioeconomic status. The discrimination wasn't always overt, but it was consistent and measurable, creating negative experiences for minority passengers that were driving customer defection and damaging long-term profitability. Today's flight on Delta Airlines, where James owned a significant but not controlling stake, was part of his ongoing assessment of industry-wide service culture. He had specifically chosen to fly first class using his accumulated frequent flyer miles rather than his executive privileges, wanting to experience the premium service that Delta marketed to high-value customers. The ticket had cost him 85,000 miles and $150 in taxes and fees, the same price that any frequent traveler would pay for a transcontinental first-class upgrade. As boarding commenced for Flight 2847, James noticed the familiar patterns that he had observed on dozens of previous assessment flights. Gate agents processed passengers with varying levels of attention and courtesy, their smiles and helpfulness fluctuating based on quick judgments about passenger status and worthiness. First-class passengers were generally treated with deference and respect, but even within that premium category, subtle hierarchies emerged based on appearance and assumptions about passenger value. James presented his boarding pass to the gate agent, a young white woman whose name tag identified her as Amanda. She scanned his ticket efficiently but without the warmth she had shown to previous first-class passengers. "Seat 3, Amanda said curtly, handing back his boarding pass without making eye contact. "Board when your zone is called." James noticed that she hadn't thanked him for his business, offered assistance with carry-on bags, or provided any of the small courtesies that she had extended to white passengers in identical situations. The differential treatment was subtle but unmistakable, setting a tone that would unfortunately continue throughout his travel experience. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 767-300, configured with 36 first-class seats arranged in a 2-2-2 layout that provided ample space and privacy for premium passengers. James had reviewed the specifications for this exact aircraft type during a fleet modernization meeting 6 months earlier, approving expenditures for upgraded seats, enhanced entertainment systems, and improved meal service equipment. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now experiencing these improvements as a passenger who was being treated as unworthy of the service standards he had personally mandated. As James made his way down the jet bridge and entered the aircraft, he observed the cabin crew conducting their pre-flight preparations. The first-class cabin was staffed by 2 flight attendants, Rachel Morrison, a white woman in her late 30s who appeared to be the senior crew member, and 𝐒𝒉𝒕𝒄, a younger Hispanic man who seemed to be assisting with beverage setup and meal preparation. Rachel Morrison had been with Delta Airlines for 12 years, during which time she had built a reputation as an experienced and capable flight attendant who knew how to manage premium cabin service efficiently. She took pride in her ability to recognize frequent flyers, remember passenger preferences, and provide the kind of personalized attention that generated positive feedback and customer loyalty. Rachel's performance evaluations consistently rated her as exceeding expectations, and she had received multiple commendations from supervisors for her professionalism and customer service excellence. But like many service industry professionals, Rachel's approach to customer care was unconsciously influenced by assumptions about passenger status, value, and worthiness of premium attention. Over her years of flying, she had developed mental shortcuts that allowed her to quickly categorize passengers and allocate her time and energy accordingly. These shortcuts were efficient from an operational perspective, but they created exactly the kind of discriminatory service patterns that James was investigating. As first-class passengers began boarding, Rachel positioned herself at the cabin entrance to welcome them aboard and assist with seating and baggage storage. Her interactions varied dramatically based on her instant assessments of passenger importance and status. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," Rachel said warmly to a white businessman in an expensive suit. "So wonderful to see you again. How was your trip to New York? Can I hang up your jacket for you?" Mr. Henderson, clearly a regular passenger on this route, smiled back with the satisfied expression of someone who felt properly recognized and valued. "Thank you, Rachel. New York was productive, but I'm glad to be heading home to Los Angeles. I'll take my usual coffee whenever you have a chance." "Of course. I remember you prefer it black with just a touch of cream. I'll bring that right over once we're airborne," Rachel replied, her voice carrying the genuine warmth that came from positive customer relationships built over multiple flights. Similar interactions occurred with several other passengers whom Rachel recognized as frequent flyers or high-status travelers. Each received personal greetings, assistance with carry-on bags, and proactive offers of service that demonstrated attentiveness and care. When James approached the first-class cabin entrance, Rachel's demeanor shifted noticeably. Her smile became more formal, her posture more rigid, and her attention less focused. She glanced at his boarding pass without the same interest she had shown in previous passengers' seat assignments. "Welcome aboard," Rachel said with professional courtesy but without warmth. Her tone suggested that she was fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing genuine hospitality. James found his assigned seat, 3A, and began storing his laptop bag in the overhead compartment. As he settled into the premium leather seat that his company had helped select during the aircraft refurbishment process, he observed Rachel's continued interactions with other boarding passengers. A white family with 2 children approached the first-class cabin, clearly excited about their upgrade to premium seating. Rachel's energy immediately brightened as she engaged with them. "Oh, how wonderful! A family upgrade," Rachel said enthusiastically. "Kids, this is your first time in first class, isn't it? Let me show you how these seats work and get you some special wings pins." She spent several minutes explaining the seat controls, entertainment system options, and meal service timing to the family, her attention completely focused on making their experience memorable and positive. The children received junior pilot wings, coloring books, and detailed explanations of the aircraft features, while the parents were offered champagne and assistance with organizing their carry-on items. The contrast between this warm, engaging service and the perfunctory acknowledgement James had received was stark and unmistakable. Rachel was clearly capable of providing exceptional customer service when she chose to do so, but her choice seemed to be based on assumptions about passenger worthiness rather than consistent service standards. As boarding continued, James documented similar patterns throughout the first-class cabin. White passengers received personalized attention, detailed explanations of services, and proactive assistance with their needs. Passengers of color were treated with basic courtesy but little enthusiasm, minimal explanation of available services, and clear signals that extended interaction wasn't welcomed or expected. The most telling example occurred when an elderly black woman, impeccably dressed in an elegant navy suit and carrying expensive luggage, approached her first-class seat. Despite her obvious wealth and sophistication, Rachel's interaction was noticeably cooler and less attentive than her engagement with white passengers of similar apparent status. "Seat 2B, Rachel said simply, glancing at the woman's boarding pass but offering no assistance with her bags or welcoming conversation. The elderly woman looked around the cabin with some confusion, clearly unfamiliar with the first-class layout and uncertain about where to store her carry-on items. Rather than offering help, Rachel moved on to assist other passengers, leaving the woman to figure out the seating and storage arrangements on her own. James watched as a white passenger, noticing the elderly woman's confusion, stepped in to help her locate the proper storage compartments and adjust her seat controls. The assistance should have come from the flight crew, but Rachel had already moved on to what she apparently considered more important duties. 20 minutes into the boarding process, an incident occurred that would define everything that followed. A white family of 4 approached the first-class cabin, but there appeared to be some confusion about their seat assignments. The father presented boarding passes that showed economy-class seats, but he insisted that they had been promised first-class upgrades at the gate. "I spoke with the gate agent about upgrading my family to first class," the man explained to Rachel. "She said she would take care of us, and I assumed that meant we would get seats up here." Rachel examined their boarding passes, which clearly showed economy-class assignments with no indication of upgrades or first-class seating. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a straightforward situation. The family would be politely directed to their assigned seats in economy class, with an explanation that upgrades required specific processing and couldn't be assumed based on verbal conversations with gate agents. But instead of following standard procedures, Rachel looked around the first-class cabin and noticed that several seats remained unoccupied, including some that had been assigned to passengers who might not have boarded yet or who might have been delayed. "Let me see what I can do," Rachel said warmly to the white family. "We do have some open seats up here, and I'd hate for you to be disappointed after expecting an upgrade." She began checking her passenger manifest, looking for creative ways to accommodate the family's request despite their lack of proper first-class ticketing. James watched this process with growing concern, recognizing that Rachel was prepared to bend airline policies and procedures to satisfy white passengers who felt entitled to the premium service they hadn't purchased. "Here's what we can do," Rachel announced after several minutes of creative problem-solving. "I have a few seats that appear to be available, and I can move some passengers around to make room for your family in first class." She began identifying passengers who could be relocated to accommodate the white family's upgrade request. The first person she targeted for relocation was James, despite his confirmed first-class reservation and proper boarding documentation. Rachel approached James's seat with a confident smile, apparently expecting quick compliance with her passenger reshuffling plan. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move to economy class to make room for this family. They were promised first-class upgrades, and we need to honor that commitment." James looked up at Rachel calmly, processing the magnitude of what she was asking. "I have a confirmed first-class reservation," he said politely. "My boarding pass shows seat 3A, and I've paid for this upgrade using my frequent flyer miles." Rachel's expression showed mild irritation at what she perceived as unnecessary resistance to a reasonable request. "I understand, sir, but these passengers were promised upgrades by our gate staff, and we need to accommodate their expectations. There are excellent seats available in economy class, and I'd be happy to ensure you receive complimentary beverages as compensation for the inconvenience." The offer was problematic on multiple levels. Rachel was asking James to give up a premium seat he had legitimately purchased to accommodate passengers who had no valid claim to first-class seating. She was treating his confirmed reservation as negotiable while treating the white family's unconfirmed upgrade expectation as mandatory. Most troubling, she was assuming that James would accept inferior accommodations to satisfy what she perceived as more deserving passengers. "I appreciate your desire to help other passengers," James replied evenly, "but I don't see any policy basis for asking passengers with confirmed reservations to give up their seats for passengers without proper ticketing. Could you explain the procedure you're following?" Rachel's face flushed slightly as she realized that James was questioning her authority and decision-making process rather than simply complying with her request. In her 12 years with Delta, she had grown accustomed to passengers accepting her judgments about seating arrangements, especially when those judgments involved accommodating passengers she deemed more deserving of premium service. "Sir, as the senior flight attendant, I have the authority to make seating adjustments that serve the best interests of all passengers," Rachel said, her tone becoming more directive. "This family was promised upgrades, and we have a responsibility to honor commitments made by our ground staff." James remained seated, his expression calm but his voice carrying quiet authority. "I'd like to see the documentation of those upgrade promises, and I'd also like to understand which specific Delta policy gives flight attendants the authority to relocate passengers with confirmed reservations to accommodate passengers without proper ticketing." The request for policy documentation caught Rachel off guard because, of course, no such policy existed. Flight attendants had limited authority to make seating changes, and those changes were supposed to be based on legitimate operational needs or safety concerns, not on subjective judgments about passenger worthiness or attempts to satisfy unreasonable customer demands. "Look," Rachel said, dropping some of her professional courtesy in favor of a more direct approach, "I'm trying to provide good customer service here. This family has been loyal Delta customers for years, and they deserve consideration when we have available seats." She gestured toward the White family, who were watching the interaction with growing discomfort as they realized their upgrade request was creating a confrontation. "Some passengers understand that flexibility and cooperation make travel better for everyone." The implication was clear. James was being selfish and uncooperative by insisting on keeping the seat he had paid for, while the White family deserved accommodation despite their lack of proper reservations. Rachel was framing the situation as a conflict between reasonable passengers who understood airline culture and difficult passengers who prioritized their individual rights over community harmony. James recognized the manipulation in Rachel's framing, but he also saw an opportunity to understand how deeply her discriminatory assumptions were embedded. "I'm curious about how you determine which passengers deserve flexibility and which passengers should provide it," he said calmly. "What factors do you consider when making these accommodation decisions?" Rachel realized that her reasoning was being examined more closely than she was comfortable with, but she had committed to a course of action and felt compelled to defend it. "Experience teaches you to recognize passengers who contribute to positive cabin environments versus passengers who create problems," she said. "Some people understand that premium service is about community courtesy, not individual entitlement." The statement revealed everything James needed to know about Rachel's service philosophy. She was making judgments about passenger worthiness based on her personal biases and assumptions, then using those judgments to justify differential treatment that violated airline policies and legal requirements for equal service. But what happened next shocked even James, who had witnessed countless examples of aviation industry discrimination during his undercover assessments. As the confrontation continued and other first-class passengers began paying attention to the dispute, Rachel decided to make her position absolutely clear. Her voice carried across the cabin as she delivered the statement that would define her career and transform Delta Airlines forever. "The Whites first, sir," Rachel said coldly, her words hanging in the cabin air like a toxic cloud. "That's how we handle boarding priority on this airline. You'll need to wait until our preferred passengers are seated." The statement was so blatantly racist, so openly discriminatory, that several passengers audibly gasped. The White family that had requested the upgrade looked horrified, clearly not expecting their seating issue to trigger such explicit racism from the flight crew. Other passengers began pulling out their phones to record what was happening, recognizing that they were witnessing something historically significant and legally consequential. James felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with moments of overt racial discrimination, but his expression remained steady as he processed the magnitude of what Rachel had just revealed about herself and her airline's culture. In 12 words, she had exposed systematic racism that went far beyond individual bias into explicit policy statements about passenger hierarchy based on race. "Did you just say that white passengers receive priority over black passengers on Delta Airlines?" James asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent first-class cabin. Rachel realized that her explicit statement had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, But instead of retreating or apologizing, she doubled down on her position. I said that experienced passengers who understand airline culture receive appropriate consideration, she replied, though her attempt to walk back her racist comment was undermined by the clarity of what dozens of passengers had just heard and recorded. That's not what you said, James responded calmly. You said, the whites first, and you directed that statement at me while trying to force me out of my confirmed seat to accommodate white passengers without proper reservations. The accuracy of his summary, combined with the video evidence being captured by multiple passengers, left Rachel in an untenable position. She had made an explicitly racist statement in front of witnesses, and her attempts to reframe or deny it were being contradicted by clear audio and video documentation. At this point, 𝐒𝒉𝒕, the junior flight attendant who had been watching the interaction with growing alarm, stepped forward to intervene. Rachel, maybe we should get the captain involved in this seating issue, he suggested, clearly hoping to de-escalate the situation before it became even more problematic. But Rachel, now committed to her confrontational approach and apparently unaware of how completely she had destroyed her career and reputation, rejected Kevin's suggestion. I can handle this situation, Kevin, she said dismissively. Some passengers just need to understand that cooperation makes travel better for everyone. She turned back to James with renewed determination. Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to move to economy class so we can properly accommodate the passengers who deserve first-class service. If you continue to be uncooperative, I'll have no choice but to call security to remove you from the aircraft. The threat of security removal for a passenger who had done nothing wrong except refuse to give up his paid seat to accommodate passengers without proper ticketing represented the ultimate escalation of Rachel's discriminatory behavior. James realized that he was witnessing not just individual bias, but systematic racism that was embedded deeply enough in Delta's culture that a senior flight attendant felt comfortable making explicitly racist statements and threats. Before you call security, James said, reaching into his laptop bag, I think there are some things you should know about this situation. Something in his tone made Rachel pause, though her expression still showed confidence that her authority would ultimately prevail over his resistance. James retrieved a leather portfolio from his bag and opened it to reveal corporate identification that made Rachel's face go white with shock and recognition. My name is Dr. James Mitchell, he said calmly, his voice carrying new authority that commanded attention throughout the first-class cabin. I'm the founder and CEO of Mitchell Global Airways, which owns 43% of Delta Airlines and has operational oversight responsibilities for customer service standards and employee conduct. The words landed in the cabin like explosive charges, creating a moment of absolute silence as their implications settled over everyone present. Rachel's confident expression crumbled as she processed what James was telling her. The passenger she had just subjected to explicit racial discrimination and threatened with security removal wasn't just another traveler. He was a major owner of the airline and her ultimate boss. I've been conducting undercover assessments of service quality across my airline properties, James continued, his voice remaining calm but carrying unmistakable authority. What I've witnessed today, including your explicitly racist comment about whites first, represents the most egregious example of discrimination I've encountered in 2 years of systematic evaluation. Rachel's hands trembled as she realized that every discriminatory word and action had been observed and would be documented by the one person who had ultimate power over her career and future in the aviation industry. Dr. Mitchell, I had no idea who you were, Rachel stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. If I had known, I never would have. That's exactly the problem, James interrupted, his tone remaining calm but firm. The quality of service that passengers receive should never depend on their identity or whether crew members recognize their importance. Every passenger deserves the same respect and courtesy you would provide if you knew they owned the airline. He looked around the first-class cabin, making eye contact with the passengers who had witnessed Rachel's discrimination and the white family whose upgrade request had triggered the entire confrontation. What happened here today isn't just about individual bias or poor judgment, James continued. It's about systematic discrimination that treats passengers differently based on race, and it's about a corporate culture that allows employees to feel comfortable making explicitly racist statements while threatening customers who expect equal treatment. The white family that had requested upgrades approached James's seat, clearly distressed about their role in triggering the discriminatory incident. "Dr. Mitchell, we are so sorry," the father said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "We never intended for our seating request to cause anyone to be treated poorly. We don't want upgrades if they come at the expense of other passengers' dignity." James looked at the family with appreciation for their recognition of the broader implications of what had occurred. "Thank you for that statement," he said. "This situation wasn't caused by your reasonable request for better seating. It was caused by an employee who chose to handle that request through racial discrimination rather than proper airline procedures." At this point, Captain Robert Martinez emerged from the cockpit, having been summoned by Kevin Torres to address what had clearly become a serious passenger service crisis. Captain Martinez was a veteran pilot with 28 years of experience, and he immediately recognized that the situation in his first-class cabin had escalated far beyond normal customer service issues. "Dr. Mitchell," Captain Martinez said, his voice carrying the respectful tone that airline employees used when addressing corporate executives, "I understand there's been a service issue that requires my attention." James stood and shook hands with the captain, noting that Rachel's discriminatory behavior had suddenly been replaced by horrified recognition of her mistake now that his true identity was known. "Captain Martinez, I've been conducting an undercover assessment of passenger service quality, and I've witnessed behavior from your senior flight attendant that violates every standard of customer service excellence and legal requirements for equal treatment," James explained. He gestured toward Rachel, who was standing frozen in the aisle, clearly understanding that her career was over regardless of what explanations or apologies she might offer. "Ms. Morrison made an explicitly racist statement about whites first, while attempting to force me out of my confirmed seat to accommodate passengers without proper first-class reservations," James continued. "She then threatened to have me removed from the aircraft when I refused to accept discriminatory treatment." Captain Martinez looked at Rachel with a mixture of disbelief and professional horror, recognizing that her behavior had created legal liability, regulatory violations, and public relations disasters that would have consequences far beyond this single flight. "Rachel, is this accurate?" Captain Martinez asked, though the question was largely rhetorical given the multiple passenger witnesses and video documentation of the incident. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but found herself unable to construct any defense that could explain away her explicitly racist statement and discriminatory actions. The video evidence was clear, the witnesses were numerous, and her victim was the airline's major shareholder and operational oversight executive. "Captain, I think I made some poor choices in handling a difficult seating situation," Rachel finally managed, her voice barely audible as she attempted to minimize the severity of what had occurred. James shook his head sadly. "Rachel, what you did wasn't a poor choice in a difficult situation. You made explicitly racist statements, engaged in systematic discrimination, and threatened a passenger with security removal for refusing to accept unequal treatment. Those aren't judgment errors. They're violations of federal civil rights laws and airline industry regulations." The full weight of legal and regulatory consequences was beginning to dawn on Rachel as she realized that her discriminatory behavior had been directed at someone with the knowledge, resources, and authority to demand comprehensive accountability. Over the next hour, as the flight was delayed to address the incident and its implications, James used the opportunity to conduct detailed interviews with passengers and crew members about their observations and experiences. What emerged was a clear pattern of discriminatory treatment that extended beyond Rachel's explicit racism into systematic cultural problems throughout Delta's passenger service operations. This incident represents a teaching moment for the entire aviation industry, James announced to the assembled first-class passengers as federal aviation authorities and civil rights investigators boarded the aircraft to document the discrimination complaint. Individual accountability is essential, but it's not sufficient to address systematic discrimination that allows employees to feel comfortable making racist statements while serving customers. We need a comprehensive cultural transformation that makes equal treatment a core business value rather than a legal compliance requirement. Rachel Morrison's employment with Delta Airlines was terminated immediately, and she faced federal civil rights violations that would impact her ability to work in customer service positions throughout the aviation industry. But her case also became a catalyst for the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program in airline history. James used his ownership position and industry influence to implement systematic reforms across all of his airline properties, creating service standards that prioritized equal treatment, training programs that addressed unconscious bias, and accountability systems that tracked customer satisfaction across different demographic groups. What Rachel said to me that day, the whites first, represented attitudes that have persisted in service industries for far too long, James explained during congressional testimony about discrimination in aviation 6 months after the incident. But it also represented an opportunity to transform an entire industry's approach to customer service and human dignity. The comprehensive reform program that emerged from Flight 2847 became a model for businesses across multiple industries, demonstrating how individual incidents of discrimination could be transformed into catalysts for systematic social change. Within 2 years, customer satisfaction scores among minority passengers across James's airline properties had increased by 47%, employee retention rates had improved significantly, and the companies had become industry leaders in diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. The business case for equal treatment isn't complicated. James reflected during an industry conference presentation about the transformation that began with Rachel's racist statement. When you provide excellent service to everyone, you build stronger customer relationships, reduce legal liability, and create positive word-of-mouth marketing that attracts passengers from all communities. Rachel Morrison, after completing court-mandated sensitivity training and community service requirements, eventually found employment with a small regional airline where she became an advocate for anti-discrimination policies and training programs. Her personal transformation from overt racist to equality advocate demonstrated that even the most problematic attitudes could be changed through accountability, education, and genuine commitment to growth. "I lost everything because of my racist attitudes and discriminatory behavior," Rachel explained during a diversity training session 2 years after the incident. "But I also gained an understanding of how my actions affected other people and why equal treatment isn't just about legal compliance, it's about basic human dignity." The story of Flight 2847 became more than just a viral video or social media phenomenon. It became a demonstration of how individual courage in confronting racism, combined with systematic commitment to cultural change, could transform entire industries and create lasting progress toward equality and justice. Dr. James Mitchell continued to travel regularly on his airline, sometimes revealing his identity to employees and sometimes maintaining his undercover assessments, but always ensuring that every passenger received the same level of respect and service excellence that had become the standard across Mitchell Global Airways properties. And the phrase, "the whites first," which had once represented the explicit racism that Rachel Morrison thought she could express with impunity, became a rallying cry for the aviation industry's commitment to ensuring that such discriminatory attitudes would never again be tolerated in any form. But the transformation didn't stop there. 6 months after the Flight 2847 incident, Dr. James Mitchell decided to conduct a follow-up assessment to measure how effectively the industry-wide reforms were being implemented. This time, he chose to travel on one of Delta's major competitors, American Airlines, to see whether the changes had spread beyond his own airline properties. What he discovered during this second undercover assessment would shock him even more than Rachel Morrison's explicit racism had months earlier. Despite the widespread media coverage of the Delta incident and the industry-wide training programs that had been implemented, systematic discrimination persisted at airlines that hadn't directly experienced the consequences of overt racist behavior. Dr. Mitchell purchased a first-class ticket on American Airlines Flight 1205 from Miami to Seattle, using the same understated appearance and casual clothing that had triggered discrimination during his Delta experience. From the moment he entered the airport, the familiar patterns of differential treatment began to emerge. At the check-in counter, his first-class ticket was examined with obvious skepticism by a gate agent who had processed identical reservations for white passengers without question. "This shows first class, sir," the agent said slowly, as if allowing Dr. Mitchell to correct what she assumed was a mistake. "Are you sure this is your correct reservation?" Dr. Mitchell presented his identification calmly. Yes, I purchased this ticket last week through American's website using my frequent flyer account. The agent's eyes narrowed as she examined his ID, then looked at his casual clothing with poorly concealed doubt. I'll need to verify this reservation with my supervisor, she announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear her suspicions about Dr. Mitchell's legitimacy as a first-class passenger. As Dr. Mitchell waited for verification of a reservation that required no verification, he observed other passengers being processed at adjacent counters. A white businessman in an expensive suit approached with a similar first-class ticket and was immediately welcomed by name, his reservation accepted without question, and his preferences noted for the flight crew. An elderly white woman was offered assistance with her luggage and detailed explanations of the premium services she could expect during her journey. When the supervisor arrived, a middle-aged white man with the bearing of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about people, Dr. Mitchell recognized immediately that he was about to experience the same discriminatory treatment that had characterized his Delta flight. "Is there an issue with this passenger's ticket?" the supervisor asked, speaking about Dr. Mitchell rather than to him, as if he weren't present to hear the conversation. "He claims to have a first-class reservation, but I wanted to double-check the booking before processing," the gate agent explained, her tone suggesting that Dr. Mitchell's claim was inherently suspicious. The supervisor examined the same documentation that had been accepted without question from previous passengers. The delay was entirely based on assumptions about Dr. Mitchell's appearance and worthiness for premium service, rather than any legitimate verification need. "The reservation appears to be valid," the supervisor finally acknowledged, his tone suggesting disappointment at not finding grounds for denial. "But we'll need additional identification to confirm you're the authorized passenger." Dr. Mitchell provided his driver's license, credit card, and frequent flyer information, submitting to a verification process that no white passenger had been required to complete. The entire interaction was observed by dozens of travelers, many of whom began recording the obvious differential treatment on their phones. Have you ever seen discrimination so blatant that it made you question whether real progress is possible? Dr. Mitchell thought, remembering the viral impact of his Delta experience and wondering whether this new incident would be necessary to create broader industry accountability. As Dr. Mitchell boarded the aircraft, he noticed that American Airlines had made a few significant changes to its service culture despite the widespread attention that his Delta experience had generated throughout the aviation industry. Flight attendants greeted passengers with varying degrees of warmth and attention, their service quality fluctuating based on their quick assessments of passenger value and worthiness. The first-class cabin was staffed by lead flight attendant Patricia Williams, a white woman in her 40s who had been with American Airlines for 16 years. Patricia had watched the Delta incident unfold in the news and had attended mandatory diversity training sessions that were implemented across the industry in response to Dr. Mitchell's experience. But like many employees, Patricia viewed the training as a compliance requirement rather than a genuine opportunity for cultural change. As first-class passengers boarded, Patricia demonstrated the same discriminatory patterns that had characterized Rachel Morrison's service on Delta. White passengers received warm personal greetings, detailed explanations of available services, and proactive assistance with seating and luggage. Passengers of color were acknowledged with professional courtesy but minimal engagement, creating a clear hierarchy of service quality based on assumptions about passenger importance. When Dr. Mitchell reached his assigned seat, Patricia's interaction was noticeably cooler than her engagement with previous passengers. "Welcome aboard," she said with practiced professionalism but without genuine warmth, her tone suggesting that she was fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing hospitality. As the flight progressed, Dr. Mitchell documented the same systematic discrimination that had plagued the industry before his Delta experience. The patterns were more subtle than Rachel Morrison's explicit racism, but they were equally consistent and measurable in their impact on passenger experience. During beverage service, Patricia spent extended time with white passengers, engaging in personal conversations about their travel plans, explaining menu options in detail, and offering additional services like extra pillows or blankets. When she reached Dr. Mitchell's seat, her demeanor shifted to efficient transaction processing. "Beverage?" Patricia asked briefly, holding her cart in position but not making eye contact or showing interest in extended interaction. "I'd like champagne, please," Dr. Mitchell replied politely. Patricia reached into her cart and poured champagne into a plastic cup, placing it on Dr. Mitchell's tray table without ceremony. She didn't explain the vintage, ask about his lunch preferences, or offer any of the additional services that she had proactively suggested to white passengers in identical situations. The differential treatment continued throughout the flight, creating exactly the kind of discriminatory experience that Dr. Mitchell had hoped his Delta incident would eliminate across the industry. But what happened next would demonstrate that even subtle discrimination could have explosive consequences when directed at the wrong target. As the flight neared its destination, Dr. Mitchell requested assistance from Patricia with a simple question about connecting flights. Her response revealed attitudes that were remarkably similar to Rachel Morrison's explicit racism, despite months of industry-wide diversity training. "I'm busy preparing for landing," Patricia said dismissively. "You can ask the gate agents about connections when we arrive." The response was curt and unhelpful, particularly compared to the detailed assistance Patricia had provided to white passengers with similar inquiries. But when Dr. Mitchell persisted with his question, explaining that he needed to understand connection logistics for an important business meeting, Patricia's true attitudes became clear. "Look, some passengers require more hand-holding than others," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I can't spend all my time explaining basic airport procedures to people who should know how to travel." The statement was less explicitly racist than Rachel Morrison's "whites first" comment, but it carried the same discriminatory implications and created the same hostile environment for minority passengers. Patricia was publicly characterizing Dr. Mitchell as someone who required hand-holding and didn't understand basic airport procedures, despite his obvious sophistication and legitimate questions about connection logistics. At that moment, Dr. Mitchell made a decision that would transform American Airlines just as dramatically as his Delta experience had changed that carrier. He reached into his laptop bag and retrieved the same leather portfolio that had shocked Rachel Morrison 6 months earlier. "Ms. Williams," Dr. Mitchell said calmly, opening his portfolio to reveal corporate identification that made Patricia's face drain of color, "I think we need to discuss your approach to customer service." Patricia's confident expression crumbled as she processed what Dr. Mitchell was showing her. The passenger she had just dismissed and insulted wasn't just another traveler. He was Dr. James Mitchell, the aviation industry executive whose Delta experience had triggered industry-wide reforms and whose influence extended far beyond any single airline. "Dr. Mitchell," Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. "I had no idea who you were." "That's the problem," Dr. Mitchell replied, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had commanded attention during his Delta confrontation. "The quality of service that passengers receive should never depend on whether crew members recognize their importance or influence." He looked around the first-class cabin, making eye contact with passengers who had witnessed Patricia's discriminatory behavior and her dismissive treatment of his legitimate service requests. "What I've experienced on this flight demonstrates that the aviation industry's commitment to equal treatment remains incomplete," Dr. Mitchell continued. "Individual training programs and policy updates aren't sufficient to address systematic discrimination that's embedded in service culture and performance expectations." Over the following hours, as American Airlines executives scrambled to respond to Dr. Mitchell's second high-profile discrimination incident, the aviation industry realized that comprehensive cultural transformation would require more than reactive training programs and public relations initiatives. Dr. Mitchell used his influence and ownership positions to create the Aviation Equality Consortium, a collaborative organization that brought together airlines, civil rights groups, customer service experts, and technology companies to develop innovative approaches to eliminating discrimination in travel. "We can't address systematic discrimination through individual accountability alone," Dr. Mitchell explained during the consortium's launch event. "We need comprehensive cultural change that makes equal treatment a core business value rather than a compliance requirement imposed by external pressure." The consortium developed revolutionary technologies for tracking service interactions in real time, identifying discriminatory patterns before they became entrenched, and providing immediate feedback to employees about their service delivery across different demographic groups. Airlines that participated in the program saw measurable improvements in customer satisfaction, employee engagement, and operational efficiency. The business case for equal treatment isn't just about avoiding negative publicity, Dr. Mitchell observed during congressional testimony about the consortium's early results. Airlines that provide consistent, respectful service to all passengers see improved customer loyalty, reduced legal liability, and enhanced reputation that attracts travelers from all communities. But perhaps the most significant impact of Dr. Mitchell's second discrimination experience was the precedent it set for ongoing accountability and continuous improvement in service equality. His willingness to conduct follow-up assessments and demand sustained progress demonstrated that individual incidents could catalyze lasting cultural change rather than temporary compliance efforts. Patricia Williams, like Rachel Morrison before her, faced immediate termination and federal civil rights investigations that impacted her ability to work in customer service positions throughout the aviation industry. But she also became part of a comprehensive rehabilitation program that helped discriminatory employees understand the impact of their behavior and develop a genuine commitment to equal treatment. "I thought I was different from the Delta flight attendant who made those explicitly racist comments," Patricia explained during a diversity training session a year after her incident with Dr. Mitchell. "But I realized that my subtle discrimination was just as harmful and just as wrong. The impact on passengers was the same, regardless of whether my bias was overt or concealed." The story of Dr. Mitchell's two discrimination experiences became a case study in business schools, civil rights organizations, and government agencies around the world. His transformation from discrimination victim to industry reformer demonstrated how individual courage could create systematic change that affected millions of people. What happened on those flights wasn't just about airline service. Dr. Mitchell reflected during a keynote address at an international conference on business ethics 3 years after his first incident. It was about the choice we all face when we encounter injustice. Do we accept it as inevitable, or do we use our resources and influence to create better systems for everyone? The Aviation Equality Consortium expanded beyond airlines to include hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and financial institutions, creating comprehensive approaches to service equality that transformed entire industries. Dr. Mitchell's experiences had sparked a movement that extended far beyond aviation into broader conversations about dignity, respect, and equal treatment in all business interactions. 5 years after Rachel Morrison's "White's first" comment had shocked the world, the aviation industry had become a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. Customer satisfaction scores among minority passengers had reached parity with white travelers across all major carriers, and discriminatory incidents had decreased by 78% industry-wide. The phrase, "the whites first," could have been the end of the story, Dr. Mitchell said during a final interview marking the 5th anniversary of his Delta experience. But instead, it became the beginning of a transformation that proved systematic change is possible when individual courage meets institutional commitment. Dr. James Mitchell continued to travel regularly, sometimes revealing his identity to employees and sometimes maintaining his assessment role, but always ensuring that the hard-won progress toward equality would be sustained and expanded. His journey from discrimination victim to industry transformer has proven that even the most entrenched biases can be overcome through persistence, accountability, and unwavering commitment to justice. The legacy of Flight 2847 and the incidents that followed would continue to influence business practices, civil rights advocacy, and social justice efforts for generations to come, proving that sometimes the most powerful force for change is simply refusing to accept that discrimination is inevitable, and having the courage to use whatever resources and influence you possess to create a more equitable world for everyone. If this story resonated with you, remember that change often begins with individuals refusing to accept racism as normal business practice. Share your own experiences with discrimination in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you believe in equal treatment for all passengers, and remember that sometimes the person you discriminate against might be the one with the power to transform your entire world.